For 500 years, 5 centuries of unbroken mastery, the Swiss made time itself. Not clocks. Not watches. Not products. Time. The kind of time that kings trusted. That astronauts wore to the moon. That sat on the wrists of presidents, conquerors, and billionaires. The kind of time that was handed from father to son, grandfather to grandson, across generations, because a Swiss watch didn't just tell the hour. It was the hour. A small, perfect, irreplaceable artifact of human civilization. Slow-motion footage of Rolex, Omega, Patek Philippe watches being assembled by hand. Gears spinning. Springs coiling. Beauty in miniature. 2,000 brands. 80,000 craftsmen. 90% of the world's luxury watch market, all inside one country the size of West Virginia. Switzerland didn't compete in watchmaking. Switzerland was watchmaking. And then, one Christmas morning in Tokyo, a $10 battery ended it all. To understand how Switzerland fell, you first must understand what Switzerland was. The story begins not with profit but with exile. In 1541, John Calvin, the Protestant reformer, arrived in Geneva and promptly banned all personal ornamentation. No jewelry. No gold. No decorative art. For the goldsmiths and jewelers of Geneva, men whose families had worked precious metals for generations, this was catastrophe. But craftsmen are nothing if not adaptive. They pivoted. They took their skills, their precision metalwork, their patience, their obsessive attention to detail, and they applied them to the one mechanical object that was both functional and permitted, the clock. Geneva's unique geography accelerated everything. The Jura mountain range, where Swiss watchmaking would take root, offered something invaluable in an age before electric light. Long, south-facing valleys that flooded with natural light in winter, allowing craftsmen to work through the short days of the alpine year. Farmers who spent their winters idle quickly became part-time watchmakers, assembling components in their homes between harvests. This cottage industry, disciplined, patient, and obsessively precise, became the economic backbone of an entire nation. By the 18th century, Geneva was producing watches of breathtaking sophistication. Abraham Louis Breguet, widely considered the greatest watchmaker who ever lived, invented the tourbillon in 1801, a spinning cage of gears designed to counteract the effect of gravity on a watch's accuracy. To this day, it remains one of the most complex mechanical achievements in human history. Marie Antoinette commissioned a pocket watch from Breguet so intricate that it took 44 years to complete. The craftsman died before it was finished. This was not manufacturing. This was art. Through the 19th century, Swiss watchmakers industrialized without losing their soul. They divided labor between specialists. One craftsman made only the mainspring, another only the balance wheel, another only the escapement, but each specialist was still a master, not a factory worker. The result was watches of extraordinary quality produced at unprecedented scale. By 1900, Switzerland made nearly 1 in every 2 watches sold anywhere on Earth. Then came the 20th century, and Switzerland's dominance only deepened. In 1926, a young German-British entrepreneur named Hans Wilsdorf achieved something that watchmakers had dreamed of for centuries, a watch case so perfectly sealed that it was completely waterproof. He called it the Oyster. He strapped it to the wrist of Mercedes Gleitze, the first woman to swim the English Channel, and when she emerged from the freezing water after 15 hours, the watch was still running perfectly. The Rolex Oyster. The world's first truly waterproof watch. Wilsdorf ran a full-page advertisement in the Daily Mail. The watch that proved itself in the English Channel. It was the first use of what we would today call an influencer campaign, and it worked. Rolex became, overnight, a symbol not just of precision, but of endurance. Of reliability under pressure. Of a timepiece that could accompany you to the edges of human experience. Then came Omega. In 1965, NASA was preparing for the Apollo missions, the most complex and dangerous human endeavor ever attempted. Engineers needed a watch that could survive the vacuum of space, extreme temperature swings from -148 to +248 degrees Fahrenheit, radiation, shock, and vibration. They tested 11 watches from multiple countries. 10 failed. One survived every test. The Omega Speedmaster. Footage of Neil Armstrong on the Moon, 1969. When Neil Armstrong set foot on the lunar surface on July 20, 1969, and spoke those words that echoed across 200,000 miles of space back to Earth, on his wrist was a Swiss watch. A Swiss watch. On the moon. At that moment, Switzerland was not just the world's watchmaker. Switzerland was the universe's watchmaker. Long pause. Music swells. Then fades. But in the same year Armstrong walked on the moon, something else happened. Something small. Quiet. Unremarkable looking. Something that would, in 10 years, reduce that entire empire to rubble. In 1945, Japan lay in ruins. 2 atomic bombs. Firebombing campaigns that incinerated entire cities. An unconditional surrender. A country on its knees, stripped of its military, its empire, its identity. But Japan's defeat planted the seeds of something the world had never seen. The American occupation brought engineering culture, management science, and manufacturing discipline. Japanese industrialists, humbled and desperate to rebuild, became obsessive students. They studied American factories. They invited American quality experts, men like W. Edwards Deming, to teach them the science of precision manufacturing. They didn't just learn. They perfected what they learned. By the 1960s, Japanese manufacturing was producing cameras, automobiles, and electronics of stunning quality at prices that Western manufacturers couldn't match. The world watched Toyota, Sony, and Hitachi with growing alarm. The Swiss watched, too, and concluded they had nothing to fear. They were wrong. In the late 1950s, engineers at Seiko, a Japanese watchmaker founded in 1881, began working on what they called Project 59A. Their goal was radical, a wristwatch that used not a mechanical spring and gear train, but a vibrating crystal of quartz to keep time. The physics were elegant. Quartz oscillates at exactly 32,768 times per second when electricity passes through it. Convert those oscillations into seconds, minutes, and hours, and you had something a mechanical watch could never be, relentlessly, inhumanly accurate. The best Swiss mechanical watches of the era lost or gained approximately 30 seconds per day, an impressive achievement, the result of centuries of refinement. A quartz watch lost or gained 10 seconds per year. On Christmas Day, 1969, Seiko unveiled the Astron, the world's first commercially available quartz wristwatch. It was a limited edition of just 200 pieces. Each one cost the equivalent of a small car, roughly 400,000 Japanese yen. It was not, at this price point, a threat to Switzerland. Not yet. But the technology existed. And technology, once it exists, only moves in one direction: cheaper. The Swiss knew about quartz watches. They had, in fact, been doing their own research. A consortium of Swiss manufacturers, including Omega, Rolex, and Patek Philippe, had developed their own quartz movement, called the Beta 21. They unveiled it in 1970. 50 companies tested it. 6,000 were produced. Then, almost inexplicably, the Swiss stopped. They looked at the Beta 21 and they made a decision that would haunt them for the next 20 years. They decided it wasn't worth pursuing. Not because it didn't work. Not because it was inaccurate. But because they simply couldn't believe that customers would ever prefer a battery-powered watch over a mechanical one. Close-up of a Beta 21 movement. Quartz, to the Swiss watchmaking establishment, was a curiosity. A novelty. Something for laboratories and ship navigators, perhaps not for the wrists of gentlemen. It was the most catastrophic miscalculation in the history of manufacturing. Because across the Pacific, in factories in Tokyo and Osaka, Japanese engineers were doing something the Swiss were not, they were making quartz cheap. The decline did not come all at once. It never does. Empires don't fall in a single battle. They erode. They rationalize. They explain away each setback with comfortable logic until one day they look around and discover that comfort was killing them all along. For Switzerland, the erosion began in 1974. That year, Japanese and American manufacturers began flooding global markets with quartz watches priced below $20. A Casio digital watch, plastic, battery-powered, accurate to within seconds per year, cost $10. A basic Swiss mechanical watch cost $60, $70, $80. For working-class consumers in America, Europe, and Asia, which is to say, for most consumers, the math was simple. Swiss watch exports, which had reached a peak of 96 million units in 1974, began to fall. The Swiss Federation of Watch Manufacturers, the central governing body of the industry, convened meetings. They studied reports. They debated. They formed committees. And they concluded, repeatedly, that quartz was a fad. The logic seemed sound, at first. Their high-end customers, the buyers of Rolex and Patek Philippe and Vacheron Constantin, were not switching to digital watches. A man who spends $10,000 on a watch is not looking for battery-powered accuracy. He is buying a statement. A heritage object. An heirloom. This was true. And this truth allowed the Swiss establishment to look past the catastrophe building beneath them. Because what was collapsing wasn't the luxury segment. It was everything else. The mass-market Swiss watch, the everyday timepiece bought by ordinary people, was being annihilated. Hong Kong manufacturers entered the market in the mid-1970s, producing quartz watches even cheaper than the Japanese. By 1978, Hong Kong had overtaken Switzerland to become the world's largest exporter of watches by volume. Switzerland's global market share, which stood above 50% in the 1960s, fell to 24% in 1978. 24%. In a decade, Switzerland had lost more than half its world market. But the numbers don't capture what this meant for the people. The Swiss watchmaking industry was not a corporation. It was a culture. In the Jura Mountains, in towns like La Chaux-de-Fonds, Lulacle, and Biel, watchmaking wasn't simply a job. It was an identity. Families had made watches for 5, 6, 7 generations. The skills were passed from parent to child as naturally as language, as religion. A watchmaker's hands were his inheritance. Between 1970 and 1983, the number of Swiss watch companies fell from 1,600 to 600. Employment in the industry collapsed from 90,000 workers to 28,000. 62,000 people lost their livelihoods in a country of 6 million people. Factories that had stood since the Napoleonic era closed their doors. Workshops that had survived 2 world wars shuttered. Master craftsmen who had spent 40 years perfecting a single discipline, men who could adjust a balance wheel by hand to within a micron of tolerance, found themselves without purpose. Without work. Without identity. The psychological toll was immense. Suicide rates in Jura watchmaking communities rose. Small towns that had thrived for centuries fell into depression, the economic kind, and the human kind. By 1980, the 2 largest Swiss watchmaking conglomerates SSIH, which owned Omega, Tissot, and Blancpain, and ASUAG, which owned Longines, Rado, and the movement maker ETA, were both effectively insolvent. SSIH had once been the world's 3rd largest watch producer. Now it was being kept alive by emergency bank loans. A Japanese company offered 400 million Swiss francs for the Omega brand alone. The banks were tempted. They were watching a 500-year empire dissolve in real time, and they were running out of ideas. It was at this moment, at the absolute lowest point, that a Lebanese-Swiss management consultant named Nicholas Hayek received a phone call. Nicholas George Hayek was not a watchmaker. He was born in Beirut in 1928, the son of a dentist. He studied mathematics, physics, and chemistry at the University of Lyon in France. He was sharp, impatient, and possessed of a quality rare in the business world, genuine vision. Not the word salad vision of corporate presentations, but the actual capacity to see what others could not, or would not, see. In 1957, with 2 children to support and no safety net, he pawned his family's furniture, secured a bank loan for 4,000 Swiss francs, and started a management consulting firm. It was the first and last time he ever borrowed money. By the early 1980s, Hayek Engineering was Switzerland's most prestigious consulting firm, advising everyone from Nestlé to Siemens to the Swiss National Railway. Nicholas Hayek had become, quietly, one of the most trusted analytical minds in Europe. In 1981, a consortium of Swiss banks called him in. Their assignment was simple and devastating: analyze the situation at Swatch and SSIH, the 2 dying giants of Swiss watchmaking, and tell us the best way to liquidate them. They wanted an exit strategy. Hayek spent months inside both companies. He studied every division, every balance sheet, every product line. He interviewed workers, managers, engineers. He traveled to Japan and examined the competitors who were destroying Switzerland. And he came back with an answer no one expected. He told the banks, don't liquidate them. Merge them. More than that, he told them Switzerland could win. The bankers were skeptical. Switzerland's market share was in freefall. Japanese and Hong Kong manufacturers had industrialized quartz production to a level Swiss factories couldn't match. Labor costs in Switzerland were among the highest in the world. The math, by any conventional analysis, said, sell what you can and walk away. Hayek's counter-argument was elegant. He said, you are trying to compete with Japan on Japan's terms, and you will lose every time on those terms. You cannot make watches cheaper than Asia. You will never be able to. So stop trying. Instead, he argued, make watches that Asia can never make. Not better mechanisms. Better meaning. Hayek had observed something that the Swiss watchmaking establishment, with its pride in mechanical precision, its disdain for cheapness, its century-long fixation on the aristocratic consumer, had completely missed. The mass market didn't just want accuracy. The mass market wanted identity. Fashion. Color. Personality. The ability to say something about who you are simply by what you wear on your wrist. Andy Warhol was putting Brillo boxes in galleries. Keith Haring was painting subway stations. Pop culture was democratizing art, making it loud, plastic, affordable, and joyful. What if a watch could do the same thing? What if a Swiss watch could be, and Hayek knew this idea would horrify his clients, fun? The Swatch was an act of audacity so complete that it bordered on insanity. Consider what Hayek was proposing. He wanted the country that had produced Rolex and Patek Philippe, that had defined watchmaking as the highest expression of mechanical craftsmanship, to make a plastic watch. Cheap. Colorful. Disposable. Made by machine. He wanted Switzerland, in other words, to do the one thing its entire identity stood against. He proposed it anyway. Because Hayek understood something the Swiss establishment did not, that luxury and accessibility are not opposites. They can coexist. A person can own a Swatch and a Rolex. They serve different emotional purposes. The Swatch, the name was a contraction of Swiss and watch, was designed by engineers Elmar Mach and Jacques Muller, who approached the problem with radical simplicity. They eliminated every component that wasn't absolutely necessary. A conventional Swiss watch contained over 90 parts. The Swatch contained 51. The case was injection-molded plastic, assembled by automated machines at a fraction of the traditional cost. The movement was ultrasonic welded directly into the case. You couldn't open it, couldn't service it, could barely break it. It was precise, because it used quartz technology. It was durable, because it was sealed. It was cheap to make. And it was achingly, irresistibly beautiful, because Hayek commissioned artists to design the faces. Every season, new collections. Hundreds of designs. Limited editions. Collaborations with Keith Haring, Vivienne Westwood, and dozens of other artists. He turned a watch into a fashion accessory. He turned a fashion accessory into a collectible. He turned a collectible into a cultural phenomenon. Cut to footage of Swatch boutiques, queues of people waiting to buy new collections, 1985 to 1990. The Swatch launched in 1983, priced at 40 Swiss francs, roughly $20. It sold out immediately. By the end of 1983, the company had sold 1 million pieces. By 1985, 3 million. By the early 1990s, nearly 100 million Swatches had been sold worldwide. 100 million. The factories that had been idle, the workers who had been laid off, the industry began to revive. The Swatch's success generated the cash flow that Hayek needed to restructure the entire conglomerate. He merged a SWAG and SSIH into a single entity, first called SMH, later renamed the Swatch Group. He automated production, standardized components, reduced the number of brands, and used the proceeds from Swatch to rebuild the luxury divisions. And here was the masterstroke, the move that revealed Hayek's true genius. While the Swatch captured the mass market, Hayek simultaneously repositioned the high-end Swiss brands as cultural artifacts rather than timekeeping instruments. He instructed his marketing teams to stop talking about mechanical accuracy, Quartz had won that argument, and start talking about heritage, craftsmanship, and emotional resonance. An Omega Speedmaster was no longer a watch that told accurate time. It was the watch that went to the moon. A Patek Philippe was no longer a precision timepiece. It was, in the words of the company's famous advertising campaign, something you never actually own, you merely keep it for the next generation. The Swiss had been beaten on technology. They retreated to something technology could never replicate, meaning. And meaning, it turned out, was worth far more. By 1985, something remarkable was happening in the Jura Mountains. The factories were running again. Not all of them, never all of them. The 1,000 brands that had existed in 1970 were gone, most forever. The 60,000 jobs that had been lost were not coming back. The cottage workshops, the family ateliers, the generations-old businesses that had survived Napoleonic wars and 2 world wars, they were mostly ash. But from the ash, something new was growing. Alongside Hayek, a young manager named Jean-Claude Biver had done something that, in 1982, seemed either very brave or very foolish. He had purchased the rights to Blancpain, one of Switzerland's oldest watch brands, essentially dormant since the 1970s, for a price of 20,000 Swiss francs. Roughly $12,000. He then set about rebuilding it with a single, defiant idea. While the rest of the industry was scrambling to produce cheaper quartz watches, Biver doubled down on mechanical. He declared, in an advertising campaign that became legendary in the industry, that Blancpain would never make a quartz watch. Since 1735, the advertisement read, "There has never been a quartz Blancpain watch. And there never will be." In 1982, this seemed like commercial suicide. By 1992, it seemed like prophecy. Something extraordinary had happened in the culture of watchmaking. The crisis, the near-death experience of the entire industry, had forced the Swiss to do something they never would have done voluntarily: explain themselves. For centuries, the value of a Swiss watch had been self-evident to anyone who could afford one. Now, fighting for survival against $10 digital watches, Swiss brands were forced to tell stories. To explain the tourbillon, what it was, why it mattered, the centuries of knowledge compressed into its spinning cage. To explain what haute horlogerie meant. To explain why a watch with a visible movement, its gears and springs dancing behind a sapphire crystal face, was something different from any mass-produced object. In explaining themselves, they created something they had never had before: a global community of watch enthusiasts. The collector market, which barely existed in 1970, exploded. Vintage Swiss watches, the very pieces that had been abandoned in drawers when Quartz arrived, began selling at auction for extraordinary prices. A Patek Philippe reference 1518 sold at Christie's for over $11 million. A Rolex Daytona Paul Newman reference, once considered a slow-selling variant, became one of the most sought-after objects in the world of collecting. The crisis had nearly killed the industry. But surviving it made that industry into something it had never been: a legend. By 2000, the Swiss watch industry had achieved something that no analyst in 1980 would have predicted as possible. It was more dominant, more profitable, and more culturally powerful than it had been at its 1960s peak. Swiss watch exports, which had collapsed to 3 billion francs in 1983, climbed back to 10 billion by 2000, and reached 21 billion by 2018. The Swatch Group became the world's largest watchmaking conglomerate, owning not just Swatch and Omega, but Breguet, Blancpain, Langens, Tissot, Rado, and a dozen other brands, a portfolio of heritage so deep that no competitor could match it. And Richemont, a South African-Swiss luxury group, built its own empire around Cartier, IWC, Jaeger-LeCoultre, Panerai, and Vacheron Constantin. The Swiss had rebuilt their empire. But they had rebuilt it on fundamentally different ground. History has a habit of rhyming. The same Swiss watchmaking establishment that dismissed Quartz in 1969, that looked at the Seiko Astron and said, "That is not our customer," now faces a new disruption that sounds uncomfortably familiar. The smartwatch. In 2015, Apple launched the Apple Watch. By 2016, it was outselling every individual Swiss watch brand. By 2022, Apple was the world's largest watchmaker by unit volume, selling more watches than all Swiss manufacturers combined. The Swiss response has been, in many ways, eerily reminiscent of 1970. Some have dismissed it. Our customer does not want a computer on his wrist. Our customer wants craftsmanship, not notifications. The Apple Watch is for a different market. These arguments sound familiar because they are familiar. They are the same arguments that Swiss executives made in 1972, 1974, 1976, right up until the moment the factories began to close. To their credit, the Swiss have also learned from their scars. Tag Heuer developed a smartwatch. Frederic Constant launched connected timepieces. Several brands have experimented with hybrid watches, mechanical movements with smart functionality. The industry is not, as it was in 1970, monolithically refusing to engage. But the existential question lingers. When a 22-year-old can buy a device that monitors his heart rate, tracks his sleep, takes calls, pays for his coffee, and looks quite sophisticated on his wrist for $300, why would he spend $3,000 on a mechanical watch that does only one thing, and does it less accurately than the $30 clock on his phone? The Swiss answer is the same answer Nicholas Hayek developed in 1983, meaning, a mechanical watch is not a timekeeping device. It has not been a timekeeping device since 1978, when Quartz made that argument obsolete. A mechanical watch is a philosophical object. It is a declaration that some things should not be optimized, that there is value in complexity for its own sake, in a mechanism that has no purpose beyond its own elegant existence, in a craft passed through human hands across centuries. Whether that argument is sufficient against the scale, the convenience, and the relentless innovation of Silicon Valley, that is the question the Swiss are living with right now. And they know, better than anyone, that the arrogant answer has consequences. Because they have lived those consequences. Every industry, every empire, every dynasty eventually faces its quartz crisis. The disruption changes railroads to airlines, encyclopedias to Wikipedia, taxis to Uber, film to digital, but the pattern is the same. A new technology arrives that does the essential thing faster, cheaper, or better. The incumbent dismisses it. The incumbent loses. Switzerland lost and then, uniquely, came back. What did they learn? What can we learn from them? Lesson 1: Your identity is not your protection. The Swiss believed their centuries of heritage made them immune to disruption. They were wrong. Heritage is valuable, but only if it is continuously earned. A name from the 17th century means nothing to a consumer in 1975 who needs to know the time and has $10 in his pocket. Identity is not a moat. It is a starting position. You must still run. Lesson 2: Dismissing a cheaper competitor is almost always fatal. When Seiko unveiled the Astron in 1969, the Swiss response was condescension. It was for a different customer. It was a fad. It was not what our buyers want. These assessments were not entirely wrong at the moment they were made. But they committed the classic error of strategic thinking. They evaluated the threat as it existed, not as it would exist in 5 years, in 10 years, when the technology became 10 times cheaper and 20 times more reliable. The question is never, is this a threat today? The question is always, what does this become? Lesson 3: Price wars destroy everyone who fights them. When Swiss exports began to fall, many manufacturers responded by cutting prices. They slashed margins, eliminated features, cheapened materials, trying to compete with Hong Kong and Japan on volume. It was a catastrophe. Cheaper Swiss watches were still more expensive than cheaper Asian watches, but now they were also worse than expensive Swiss watches. They occupied a no man's land of quality and value that satisfied no one. The brands that survived the crisis were those that moved decisively in one direction, either downmarket with radical innovation, the Swatch, or aggressively upmarket with uncompromising quality. The middle ground was a death trap. Lesson 4: A consortium moves at the speed of its most conservative member. The Swiss watch industry in 1970 was organized as a network of legally protected guilds and consortiums. Innovation required consensus. Consensus required everyone to agree. And in an industry of proud, independent craftsmen, agreement was nearly impossible. By the time the Swiss Federation of Watch Manufacturers concluded that quartz was a genuine threat around 1977, Japan had an 8-year head start. This is why startups beat corporations. Not because they are smarter. Because they can decide on a Tuesday and execute on a Wednesday. Legacy industries move at the speed of committees. Lesson 5: The answer to technological disruption is often not technology. This is the counterintuitive lesson, the one that takes the longest to learn. Nicholas Hayek did not beat Japan by making better quartz. He beat Japan by making quartz emotional. He understood that when a technology makes a product objectively better in every measurable way, the incumbent cannot win by measuring. They must change what is being measured. The Swiss lost the argument about accuracy in 1975. So they stopped making that argument. Instead, they made a new argument, that a mechanical watch is not about accuracy at all. It is about beauty, heritage, craft, identity, and connection to something larger than any individual life. That argument, ridiculous on its face, impossible to quantify, resistant to any spreadsheet, is worth $21 billion a year. The Swiss did not just survive the quartz crisis. In some sense, they were made by it. The empire that exists today, Rolex commanding waitlists of years, Patek Philippe watches selling for millions at auction, Swatch launches drawing crowds like rock concerts, that empire would not exist without the decade of near-death that preceded it. The crisis stripped away every brand that was not worth saving. It forced the survivors to become ruthlessly clear about what they actually were, what their genuine, irreplaceable value was. Most industries, when threatened, try to defend what they have. The Swiss, when they finally understood what was happening, did something harder and braver. They reinvented what they were. There is a watchmaker in Geneva today. He is, perhaps, 32 years old. He trained for 4 years, 4 full years of doing almost nothing but learning to hold tiny tools correctly, to see through a loop without blinking, to feel the resistance of a spring with his fingertips. He works in a temperature-controlled room because the heat of his hands, transmitted through his tools, can affect the precision of what he makes. He makes perhaps 1 watch per month. Each watch will sell for more than he earns in a year. He knows his phone is more accurate than what he makes. He also knows that what he makes is worth something that his phone never will be. A mechanical watch is, in some sense, an argument against efficiency, against optimization, against the relentless drive to make everything faster and cheaper and better. It is a small, beautiful, unnecessary thing, and it is beloved precisely because it is unnecessary. The Quartz Crisis nearly destroyed the Swiss watch industry. But the Swiss watch industry endured, and endured specifically because there are people in this world who believe that some things should not be optimized, that some crafts should not be automated, that some objects should carry within them the memory of the hands that made them. That is an argument 500 years old. And if history is any guide, it will still be winning arguments 500 years from now.